Hello, good morning. Welcome to part 3. I'm waiting for the good mornings in the chat as to I know that you guys can hear me. Good morning. Yeah, sharing UTC would be better, but I don't live in UTC, I'm sorry. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Okay, perfect. The sound is working. The video is working. Stream is on again. It's 8 o'clock here again. I am not a morning person. You can see that. Anyway, I'm happy to be here with you again. Um, okay, let's kick this off. So far this class has been rather slow, which is me like staring at the screen and making things up in my head. I want to try to honestly skip the rest of the slides and go straight to the binary. That's something I've been thinking last night because there isn't really much important stuff left in the slides. The control structures is the last chapter that we haven't looked at. But that's something that we're going to see in the binary anyway. So let's get this started. I'll be honest with you, I haven't had my coffee yet this morning, so I might look slightly confused, but don't worry, I got this. Um, First of all, first of every class, I would like to tell you to make sure you have the exercise binaries from the right spot at your hand, because not everyone might have followed the first two classes. So let me just quickly show you again where they are hosted. Namely, the material for this class is located on github.com, BlackHoodie RE, BlackHoodie_virtual. This, my friends, is where there are two binaries, two Windows PE files for download. One's called virtual.bh.exe. This is a simple exercise binary. And then there's SQLite3.dll. That's a little more complicated. It's a big Windows DLL. All right. Once you make sure you have these binaries, then let's start straight away inside of our disassemblers because it's so much fun. Disassembler. Yeah. Okay, please open up IDA Pro and load the virtual.bh.exe binary. That's the one we're going to be looking at today. Yeah, and while you guys do this, I will have a sip of coffee. Yay. Mornings are wonderful. Awesome. Now, where to start? Okay, this is a beautiful opening screen of IDA Pro. If you load the binary, again, IDA asks you which default config or which configuration to use. And if you load any given Windows PE, like a portable executable file, usually Windows auto analysis is pretty good. Like the default settings work pretty fine. A thing that we haven't dived in deep the last time is like how IDA Pro manages to find functions in a binary, which for me is one of the main signs of quality of a disassembly framework. That means that if we want these beautiful function graphs, like you see this block in front of you, IDA Pro needs to be able to determine where a function starts, which here would be this sub instruction, sub-RSP, and the return instruction in the end. A quick recap of the last class. So in the first class, we learned a lot about registers, and the last class we learned about function stacks. I hope you folks did the homework and read those blog posts I recommended. Like the 64-bit Windows calling convention is a little more complicated than the older 32-bit ones, like the CDEC one that we talked about as well. But all together, the convention is very complex, but that is just so you have a lot of space in that convention for a lot of different functions to be called. In other words, if we look at normal tame little C functions, the calling convention remains very simple, or the way they are called, adhering to that calling convention remains very simple. So what we're going to be seeing a lot today is arguments being transferred to registers, arguments being transferred from registers to stacks inside of a called function. Some arguments might be stored on the stack to begin with, like transferred through a slot on the stack, but in 64-bit Windows executables, that's rather uncommon. In order for that to happen, you need more than 4 arguments that are handed over to a given function. What we're going to be looking at as well a little bit is, yeah, we're going to recap the import table and the imports, because those are very important. And we're going to see how to follow function calls in a binary, like we get from one function to another function. And what's the difference in functions? Like why do we not analyze library functions, and why do we not analyze like the printf function, like the imports, etc. Okay, and after that we're going to be looking at structures, at yeah, binary structures. How decision making inside of a binary works, how data processing inside of a binary works, how strings are processed in a binary, and so on and so forth. Good. Then let's start right into this first function. Also, remember the last time I showed you the start function versus the main function? Let's jump to the main function. If you follow me on the left side, here is the function menu where you see a function called main. By the way, the function is called main because IdaPro named it main. I mentioned last time all the naming, all the nice commentary and all the variable names and the function names that you see in here. That's IdaPro's invention. So IdaPro analyzes the binary when you throw it in and comes up with these cosmetics to make it easier for us analysts to read through binary. But again and again, I will always say that these tools can be mistaken. So any name that you see there is nice to have, but if the disassembler is confused, it might spit out the wrong name, and that is very upsetting if you're not sure what you're doing. Awesome. Yeah, and we're here right on the main function. And don't forget that this is not the first thing that is executed when the binary is loaded, at least not in our case here. What comes first is the start function where the entry point is pointing to, which loads the C runtime before our actual code can execute. That is slightly different depending on which compiler and which compiler settings we use for building a given binary. In our case, it's a very short start function. Anyhow, what we actually want to do, enough of the recap, is read assembly. Oops. So let's go. In our main function here, and if you really want, you can go ahead and cheat and fetch the code file, like the virtualbh.c that's on the GitHub. I recommend you not to right now, because that would take the excitement away. But yeah, again, I can't control you. You can cheat as much as you want. If we look at this main function here, one thing I wanted to note is that I did not use any optimization settings. Like I turned off all optimization that was there to turn off in Visual Studio. Typically, if you do that with a compiler, there is one optimization that remains, which is the dead code elimination, which is why we see a lot of printfs in this binary. Whether start with that. So if you write a function or if you write a code block in your C application, and this code block produces data or produces some sort of produce, if you want to put it like that, but that result is not going anywhere. Like it's not used in a subfunction, it's not used in a printf, it's not used in the data dependency. Then that code will be eliminated by the compiler because it's useless. And if you write your own binaries and you want to go reverse engineering about simple things that that like produce results that aren't used anywhere in the binary, like you want to see how an addition looks like, you want to see how division looks like, then you better add a printf or any sort of data dependency after you produce that result that you want to see. Otherwise, your compiler will go, no, we don't need this, and yeah, take it away. That said, I'm talking a lot and not reverse engineering very much today. What do we do? If you look at this function, you see right at the very start is sub RSP38. If you remember the calling convention, like the function stacks, like how stack works, if you subtract something from RSP, what you do is you create space on the stack. If you remember, where are my slides in there? If you remember again how a stack looks like, let me quickly throw up the slide. If you remember how a stack looks like, just so that we can make sense of this once and for all, the stack grows downwards. That's an Intel architecture specific thing. It grows from the high addresses to the low addresses. So if you take ESP and we add a number, like let's say we add +8, then we jump below one 64-bit entry on the stack, like and that way we free one slot for a variable on the stack. If we add the same amount of bytes, like the same number, we push the stack pointer upwards so that it allocates space on the stack. But then, when we are right there at the beginning of a function, right here, the first part of the stack frame setup has already happened. If you look at it that way, in this point in time, where we are in the stack frame is actually here, where EBP should be pointing to, right here. Why is that? Naturally, because the arguments to the function are treated with before we call the subfunction, and the return address is pushed on the stack by the calling instruction. The local variables are dealt with the local function. Something that might be confusing in these situations, like I know that they were confusing for me when I started reverse engineering, is that in here, so you see the structure of the stack on my slide, and you see it in the blog post I pointed out, and you see like lots of diagrams of how a stack looks like. In the binary, there is no such graphic. Like in the binary, you have to imagine how the stack looks like that your functions are operating. That's not always easy. It's not always necessary to have the clear picture of how exactly the stack looks like at a given point in time. So don't worry, like don't sit there with the graph and start painting diagrams. It is important to understand how the stack works and why we see certain elements in our function. Like why is a sub RSP here? Why we have the add RSP here? Why do we have, like, what exactly does the return instruction do and stuff like that? That's things we need to understand. But we don't need the exact image of how the stack grows and shrinks in our head. But yes, again, it is important to understand, like, why does a sub, why does a decrement of RSP create space on the stack? That is weird. Then the second question in this instruction is, why is there 38? If you look, why do we need that much space? Then that would be because of the local variables that we will see, but also because of the home space that we automatically allocate on the stack. And this is something that the blog post I pointed you guys to can explain much better. But for some obstruse optimization reason, the call stack, no matter how many arguments you hand over to Windows x64 function, the call stack still reserves space on the stack for those arguments. They are coming in registers, they're handed over in registers, but the stack still holds space, which is why the smallest amount of allocation that we see here is 28. So 28 in hex, 28 hex. In our case, this is 38 hex because we have two 64-bit like quad word local variables. About those variables, before we go reading through that whole stash, what you see up here is IDA Pro giving us information. And the real binary, that's not there. If you look at it at a different disassembler, this might look different or might not be present at all. This is like a nice listing from IDA that says like we found two local variables in this function. IDA Pro finds those by, again, looking at the stack pointer and base pointer dereferentiation. So like, if you look down here, here's RSP plus 38 to find the base of the stack, plus var10 to find the variable inside of the variable space on stack. By looking at this dereferentiation here, like we store a 6 to that variable space on the stack. By looking at this, IDA Pro knows that there is this specific variable in the binary and makes an entry in the variable list up here. That is very helpful, and again, it can be wrong, but most of the time it's very helpful. And yeah, the same thing happened with the variable 18. By the way, the names don't really tell us much, except that the variable is located minus 10 hex bytes from the base of the stack. That, yeah, really doesn't tell us much. Interestingly, though, if you look at the calculation, it says plus 38, and then in reality, this is a minus 10. So it's called variable 10, but the value is minus 10. So this turns into minus 10. So then with the RSP plus 38, we walk down the stack. We walk back to where we came from here at the entry. And then with minus 10, we walk back up and step into that space that we allocated. Yeah, wonderfully confusing. Again, think about the stack, this box of stack where you have like the base of your function, then you allocate space, which means you subtract 38, like hex 38, walk up. Then to get back to your variables, you walk back down, you walk those 38 bytes, hex 38 bytes back down, and then with minus 10, you walk a slot back up to fetch your local variable, or like to get to that space where it's supposed to be stored. Beautiful. Okay, the last thing to note about the stack in here is this add RSP back here. As you can imagine, this instruction frees the stack space that we have allocated. So here we make some space, and here we give away the space so that when we return, the stack pointer is back to where we came from. Something that's important about functions, and that's the essential of detecting functions in a disassembler as well, is that they're not supposed, or that they by no means are they allowed to tip the balance of the stack, and also they're not allowed to dirty certain registers. But that's a different story. The stack pointer, as it sits right here, can help a lot in detecting these functions. If you start at the beginning of like you have disassembled the whole binary, Then you look at where the stack pointer is incremented and decremented, and you come up with where it's supposed to be 0. So like, the secret is that at the beginning and the end of each function, the stack pointer needs to be where it used to be. You can't leave a function with a stack pointer that's still pointing into the middle of a stack frame. In most binaries, I have to watch out not to say definite things, because if you look at malware and cryptors and packers, you see a lot of stuff that shouldn't happen. And that includes messing up with function stack frames and thereby messing up with disassembler tools. That stuff is happening. But in a good, nice little C written binary, this is not what's happening. So in here, you can rely on the stack pointer to do what the stack pointer is supposed to do. You will notice that in this function, there is no RBP. There is no base pointer. In cdecl, we would have stored the base pointer on the stack as well to save it. Here, this is not happening. Yeah, 64-bit comes with a couple of optimizations that make binaries smaller and faster. Okay. The other thing that looking at stack clutterage helps us with is to discard it and focus on the important parts, which is everything that's in between. Now, if we start here, having a quick look, you see a lot of call instructions here. There is altogether 5 calls. I'll be honest with you, I put 5 exercise functions into, actually it's 6 exercise functions into the code. So we can have a look a bit about how functions look like, how they're called, how they're returning, how the arguments are handled, and so on and so forth. And yes, this is what we're going to be doing today. Let's start with the first. That's going to be a quick one. Remember, this one was the one that was named in the wrong manner last time, and I renamed it to its natural form. Renaming in either Pro works with N. If you quickly follow me and click the N button, that will be interesting. Now, this is actually not shown in Twitch. That's sad. I suppose I could create another window capture to show you, but I don't think it's important enough to deal with that right now. Anyway, you have to follow me blind. If you put your focus, like your cursor, on the first function and you click N, like small n, you get a little pop-up that says rename address, which is wonderful. You can rename addresses, you can rename variables, you can rename constant variables, you can rename locations, you can rename a whole lot of stuff in IDA Pro. And that helps us if we analyze bigger binary and, for example, you just spent days on a big function that is very important, and there is 20 other big functions, 200 other big functions that are very important. Then you might want to write down your findings, and in either Pro you can write them down inside the tool, which is super helpful. That's mostly done with renaming things, like renaming functions and variables. In our case here, if you clicked N, you see the name tab that says sub underscore 14,1250. Follow me and call this hello world for completeness sake. If we type hello world in there and hit enter, all of a sudden we see a new name in the disassembly. We can also put a comment, which happens with semicolon. Whoops. Don't do what I just did, whatever I did. Repeatable? That's not what I wanted. Apologies. It's been a while since I've been at a pro. Comment. This is what I wanted. If you want to put commentary, like you put a comment into C, you put your cursor in the line where you want the comment, and then you type in a semicolon. Is it called semicolon? Like the double dots. double dots. You click double dots. Apologies for my English. And then you get a little pop-up that says, please enter text, and you can enter a comment. Or I type, this is my comment. And then if you click OK, you see a commentary pop up in the screen. Beautiful. If you do comments and you analyze a bigger binary, tip from me, make it clear what exactly you want to say in your comments, because binaries are big and you will end up leaving a lot of comments. And then if you take your notes and later on you don't know anymore why you took the specific note, then you're screwed. So be clean and proper about that. Good. I see a lot of comments in the chat. Is there any specific questions that I should pick up right now? Let me have a quick look. Before the first sub-instruction, is RSP equal to RBP? Is RSP plus 38 a way to get back to RBP? So I'm not sure. RSP and RBP are not the same thing. They're two different pointers. Their values can be the same. At the beginning of the function, in our specific case, they might be the same, but we don't know because we don't see RBP in there. Apparently, RBP is not used in this function. In CDACL, there were very clear rules about how. Oh, wait, to answer that question, let me quickly throw up the slide again. If I can. Chrome, here we go. In CDACL, there were very clear roles for EBP and ESP. Like they were having very clearly defined jobs. So like at the beginning of the function, EBP and ESP were the same. And then as the function kept executing and growing the stack, ESP would wander up and EBP would stay right here at the beginning of the local function stack. In 64-bit, people recognize, like decades of engineering recognize that EBP can be used for other purposes and is much better off if it doesn't point to the stack. Because essentially, in 30-bit CDACL, we have two pointers pointing to the stack at all times, one at the bottom and one at the top. That's a little bit of an overkill. If you ask the compiler engineers, like a register is a valuable resource, and if we can use it for something else, maybe we can just use ESP to reference all the things that are on the stack. It really doesn't make that much difference. That's the thought behind it. But please don't ask me about exact compiler optimization thoughts and processes. That's beyond me. And if you want, I can recommend you a literature about why exactly the pointers were used for different purposes. But yeah, this will all make a lot more sense when we start looking at function calls specifically. You'll see what exactly the registers are doing there. And again, you can't learn reverse engineering from a book. You need to be doing the thing, and then eventually things will click. We look at all the theory so that you have an idea of what to expect in the binary, of what's going to come up in the code. And I've been talking about that a lot. Let's actually reverse engineer a function for once. Thanks for the people in the stack explaining things. That's great. Okay, IDA Pro, where are you? Here we are. Let's just have a quick look at the hello world. You saw I already renamed it to hello world. You could have guessed this is the hello world. And in there, surprise, surprise, you see the sub RSP28 and the add RSP28. Now this is rather useless. This function really does not need a big stack frame. If we turn on optimizations, these sub instructions, like the sub and the add, will be gone. You'll only see these two in the function. If at all, like this is a perfect candidate for inlining. like function inlining, the compiler might see that we don't actually need the call to hello world at all. We just saw. If I step back, here's a call to a function, and inside that function, we execute two instructions. For a compiler, that would look like the first call, the call to hello world, isn't actually needed at all. And we can just take these two instructions and execute them in the inside of the calling function. That's called function inlining. And it's within the reason why original C code of an application and compiled binary code are very often not actually matching, like not at all, like not at all. Compiler optimization is tricky. Again, this is why I turn it off in this binary. And this is why we see this rather useless stack allocation here. Whoops. And freeing it down there. What we see in the middle is you have one argument, which is a constant, which is hello world, loaded into RCX, and RCX is the first argument to any given called function on Windows x64. In our case here, this is a code import, the printf function, which is, again, it's an import in the import table, and at the time that we're looking at it here in the static representation, this code isn't actually there. You can see that when you double click on printf, you land in this pink section, which is the import data, import section. And in there you see the import listed, which means we as reverse engineers without running the binary cannot see what code is executed in that function. We can look up the documentation. You can Google what printf exactly does and see what kind of arguments it expects and what activity it performs. You can do the same, by the way, with other functions, like the imp is not part of the function name, but the stringlen is, and accept filter and a message exit. And I have no idea what most of these do, but you can Google yourself happy. That is good. We appreciate that there's function names that we can Google, so we can look at the documentation. And whatever you can look up in the docs, you don't need to reverse engineer. That's the important part about why these imports and the function names that IDA produces for us are important. Okay. Once we start debugging, I think that's what we're going to do on Thursday. Yes, once we start debugging, I can show you that this will actually resolve to an actual function, but only at runtime. Remember, the Windows loader needs to fetch our binary, needs to map it to memory, needs to resolve the imports and load the libraries that contain these specific functions, and only then we can call the actual printf function as it is present in memory. Okay, this much about APIs. Let's go to the next one. This one's starting to get kind of boring. Okay, sorry. So what I did, I stepped back to the main function, and there I picked the second function that we see in this little piece of code right below hello world. By the way, if I'm talking along and you're missing about what I'm talking about and which function I'm at, you can directly jump to these function addresses. Let me quickly show the hotkey for that too. That's the G. If you click on the G, you get a box that opens that says jump to address. And in there, you get to enter a function address. And there, if I go and type in the 14,1270, oops, 14,1270, you guys can see the pop-up box, I suspect, yes. And click OK. I get to the same function naturally because it's the same address. Let me put something more interesting. If I look on the left side of the function list, there's a function that's named sub_14,000, 1000. The 14,000, 1,000, that's the address of the function in memory. So sub means subroutine underscore, and then the address, that's the naming scheme for IDLEPRO. If it doesn't know what's going on in the function, it gets such a generic name. And we, in return, can use the jump to address box. Again, you click on G, you get a little box that opens this jump to address. You type any of these addresses in there and click OK, then IDLEPRO takes you directly to that function. See, it's 14,1000. And that works with any given address. So like if you happen to find out that a very interesting thing is located at a specific address, you just click G and G takes you there. That also works with function names. If I go G and click, type in hello world, it takes me straight to the hello world function that we just named before. This is also why naming makes sense. People are very bad in remembering addresses, but they can remember names. And then even if the function doesn't make sense yet, like say we don't know this is a hello world and we just want to, mark we've been here and we've looked at this, then you can type in this has been analyzed as a function name and you will know that you've been there before. It sounds stupid, like a dog walking around and peeing on trees, but if you have a very big binary with a lot of different functions, it can get complicated very quickly, and you will want a way to just track your progress, even if you haven't figured out yet what a function means, or what a variable means, or what a constant means. You will want to remember that you have looked at it before. And people come up with all sorts of funny naming conventions for ununderstood but recognizable things. Okay, where were we? I'll zoom us back to the function that we wanted to look at. I just double clicked on it in the function pane. That was sub underscore 14,000, 1270. All right, let's jump right in. We have two local variables again, minus 14 and minus 18. The bytes that are allocated, like the sizes that these variables have, indicate the data types that were used. For example, these are both D-word values. That means they're 32 bits wide. I don't know if that matters to us, but we'll see. If we look, let's just go instruction to instruction. First instruction again allocates space on the stack for our arguments and the registers, sorry, the local variables that we're going to use. I just see that we did not have any arguments. If you remember, I say and have a look. If you remember what the function was called, there is no arguments being handed to registers or anything pushed to the stack. So we can assume that this function does not actually accept arguments. By the way, we have these beautiful notes up here from IDLEPRO. IDLEPRO would tell us if it found arguments in this function. If that were not there, our only chance to see which arguments are handed over to a function is have understood the calling convention and know how arguments are being handed over, and then analyze the call and see whether this is occurring or not. That's usually how you go about looking for arguments if you don't have all this analysis being done. Then, next instruction, we store a constant value to our stack variables, namely A and 8C. Again, these two are located on the stack. So you walk down to the base of the stack and then you find yourself your variable in there. I keep talking about the stack so much. That's you guys understand there's a stack behind all of this, but in reality, again, I don't actually go thinking about the stack layout as I go reverse engineering, mostly because IDA does such a nice job in renaming variables already. So you see, I click on this, it highlights the use of variable 18 or var 18 in all of the function. We can just think about this as a classical C variable. Like forget the stack that's underneath for a second and think about it just as a variable. So the variable is assigned a value. Here's a move instruction. We haven't talked about individual instructions yet. Most instructions in x86 are self-explanatory, at least the simpler ones, like move something, subtract something, add something, LEA means load effective address. It loads an address into a register. Call is an instruction that calls a certain offset. We don't have any chumps in here, which is a bit boring. IMUL is the multiplication. And CDQ and IDIF we will have a closer look at later on. Yeah, and that's a simple and stupid way about in going about reading instructions. We will need to understand about how certain instructions work exactly. But for most of them, it is rather simple, like adds two values and stores the result in the first operand. Move moves a value and stores the result in the first operand, and so on and so forth. There is a slide upcoming in the slide deck that we haven't looked at yet, where I summed up most of the interesting instructions without any explanations, though. For the explanations, something that we don't have time in this class, but what I would recommend you do if you go reverse engineering on your own, which you should do after this class with this exercise binary, is you open up a page in Google, and whenever an instruction comes up that you don't understand, you look up the documentation and you read through the instruction documentation once. I say once because, again, most of these instructions are self-explanatory one or another way, and the documentation tends to be very confusing. And yeah, the docs by themselves aren't incredibly useful when trying to read a binary, just because there's so many instructions and you don't want to spend all day reading documentation. What I recommend you do right now is follow me as we go reverse engineering through this function, and I will tell you what each instruction does. And on the way, your brain will catch up on what these instructions are intending to do as you go reading the stash by themselves. It sounds like voodoo, but really, the first time I ever reverse engineered a binary, I opened it in a disassembler and I started reading the first instruction. I started reading until I got stuck because there was something coming that I didn't understand. And then I went to Google, and Google gave me the answer for what I didn't understand. Google is the best reverse engineering tool on the planet. It knows everything. Somehow, all of the issues that we can face inside of a binary, most of them have been had by other people. And yeah, that's then went ahead and posted the question on Stack Overflow or Reverse Engineering Exchange. And yeah, someone answered, which is really very helpful as we go analyzing. Well, it all sounds like cheating, but trust me, everybody relies on Google or any other search engine of your choice as much as I do. That said, let's finally reverse engineer something. So again, we have this move instruction, which stores A in variable 14, and another one that stores 8C in variable 18. Then you see something that wouldn't happen if we had code optimization. We load variable 18 back into a register, EAX, and we load variable 14 into ECX. As I noted before, we're looking at 32-bit variable sizes, and 32-bit variable sizes fit into 32-bit registers. The compiler saw that, and the compiler used EAX and ECX instead of RAX and RCX. Don't worry, in most cases, so you see the highlight of IDA actually catches up with that and sees here's RCX and ECX. And for us, when we read, usually it's not that important about like which data sizes we're looking at. If we analyze code in detail, like if you look at an algorithm that deobfuscates a piece of code, that deobfuscates strings, you might be interested in widths and sizes. But if you just look at the function and want to get a quick overview, you don't go all the way down to the level of counting bits. Good. What we do then is we add both values. Here's ECX plus EAX, and the result lands in ECX. Then we move that value into EAX. You see there's lots of useless stuff going on. Like we could have loaded the A into EAX, and we could have, sorry, into ECX in this case. And we could have loaded the 8C into EAX, and we could have then just added both into EAX instead of ECX. So we could have saved that move, etc., etc. And that move to EDX here is the first argument for printf. Never mind. But in these four instructions, there's a lot of double work going on, and the optimizer would have kicked out immediately. The reason why I didn't use optimization is so we preserve this beautiful function frame and the beautiful extra instructions that explain things to us. Yeah, with optimization, this function would look really, really short. Okay, where are we? So at this point in time where EAX is moved into EDX, EAX holds the sum of these two values. If we want to know what these two values look like in decimal, let's put your cursor on them and right-click on the value. You get a pop-up. You won't see my pop-up now, I know, but if you look at that pop-up, like right there in the middle, it says 10, and then 12O, and then 101B. Those are different representations that IdaPro can give us for the same value. Remember, inside of a binary, everything is numbers. All of what you see in front of you is IdaPro's interpretation of those numbers of the bytecode in the binary. And IdaPro saw this constant value, and it displays a hex value for us. Because computers think in zeros and ones and hex and all that together. For us humans, decimal might be a better option. Like decimal is something more interesting to look at if we look at arithmetic. So follow me and convert this A into a 10. And do the same thing with the 8C. Right click. And if you look very closely, there's tiny icons in there. There's like a mini 10 and a mini 8 and a mini 2. That's for decimal and octal and binary representation. There's also an X, I think that means convert to character. If this was an ASCII character, we could convert it straight to the ASCII representation, like the text. Anyhow, we want the decimal. And here we have 140. Now it's much clearer what's happening. We have this addition on here, which adds 10 to 140. So by the time we load the value into EDX, the value is 150. Dum dum dum. Then what happens? EDX, if you remember the calling convention, is the second function argument, and RCX, in this case here, holds the first argument. So we have two arguments that are handed over to printf. If you look at the second argument, it's a constant. It's nicely named by IdaPro A addition D. However we get to that name, you see the comment here next to it that tells you what value is located, or what value is pointed to by this address. By the way, this is an address. It has a name, but if I would go and remove that name, we would see an address. That's what I did. I clicked N, removed whatever was in the box, and then IdaPro comes back with the automatic naming, which tells us ASCII. It's an ASCII pointer underscore, and this is the address of where it's located. Everything in the binary has a location, and locations are valuable information, like this address. Okay, and with this comment here, you saw that before in the hello world. With the comment, IdaPro tells us of like what string we found at this address. By the way, you can double click on it too. Whoops. No. You can double click at this address, right? And then you are taken to the actual string. So if I double click, I end up at 14,030.10, which is where the addition string is located. You also see the hello world up here. This is neat. And in there, you see the actual bytes of the string. If you would look at an ASCII table, a big A would be 41, a small d would be 64. There's two of them. The I would be the 69, the T would be the 74. 69 is an I again. You see these two, 6F is a O, and so on and so forth. So like here's where the real strings are located. They're slightly cut off to save space, but yeah. As an analyst, we don't usually go reading ST uh, ST bytes in the file, but we hope that our tool can properly represent us with what exactly is stored there. With escape, we get back to our source function. Yes, by the way, once you remove the name from a variable, you can't get it back. So if I wanted to name that again, I would have to name it myself, and I'm too lazy for that. Back to the function call. What happens is we have these two arguments, 150 lands in argument 2, and the string, or a pointer to that string, lands in RCX, and then we call printf. Printf then prints this data on the screen. So we just added two values and told the user about it. Beautiful. The same, like a very similar operation happens with the multiplication down there. Multiplication looks the following way. So we load, again, a variable into a register. We know at this point in time, variable 14 has the value 10. Something confusing about reading assembly is that it's not like reading C from left to right and next line from left to right. It's more like reading from the top to bottom and from the bottom to top. It works both ways. You notice if we see here variable 14 being loaded into EAX, if we only saw this part down here, like this snippet, we wouldn't know what's in variable 14. We would have no idea what the value of this variable would be when we load it for our multiplication. But we can follow this value up in the binary. You can follow it upwards and see where it's initialized, and that is here. We load the 10 in here. Now this tiny little function, it seems stupid that I even explain it, but imagine we look at a very, very big function with a lot of these boxes, and you see an operation that interests you, or you see like a function call, an API call that looks very interesting to you, and you want to figure out what the input values are. Like you see the function arguments being loaded for the call, and you want to figure out what it is that's in those arguments. Often what you do is like you highlight your variable and you walk up the function tree. Important about local variables is they are local. As the name says, they are only present in this given function. That is opposed to globals. If you look at this string, for example, this address hasn't been initialized in there. It's hard-coded in the binary. Not present in this function, but totally possible is that we have these kind of addresses like as variables, not as constants like the string, but as variables, and they can be initialized anywhere in the binary. Like you can have one function feeding your variables and another function taking action based on those variables. That's a very classical thing to do. And then we will be interested in following a certain variable in the function. This we usually do with cross-references. More about that later. Let's go back to the multiplication. So again, if you want to follow a local variable, like the use of a local variable, you have to see where else in the binary it is used. The highlighting is very, very helpful. If you're working with a different tool that doesn't offer the highlighting, then you just go reading a lot of assembly. And you look like for the same thing popping up again. And then what interests us most is the writes. Whenever you go reverse engineering something, reads like this one are cool, but writes are the important part. Like where is stuff initialized? Where is it changed? How is it modified? How does it travel through the logic? That's usually what we're looking at for. And in our case here, we see the right where the 10 is stored into variable 14. Again, this is just a very simple example, so you see what I mean before we start on to the big stuff. After we loaded the 10, variable 14 holds a 10 into EAX, we multiply that value with the variable 18. That's the 140. So 140 times 10 is a result that we expect inside of EAX. As a general rule for most instructions is that on Intel, they are read backwards. Like in the Intel annotation, that is, they're read backwards. There's different annotations called the AT&T annotation, which is what most Linux tools use, actually. They read from left to right. It's very confusing to see both annotations next to each other because they're like exact opposite in the reading direction. And granted, the Intel notation is not the most natural. Like you have the IMUL, you start reading which is the value we want to multiply with what, which is in the AAX, and then we store the result on the left side. The move reads from the right and stores on the left side. And so on and so forth. Many instructions do that, and that's Intel annotation specific, and I would say Intel specific, yeah. I'm not sure about that, but we're looking at binary. It's like somehow x86 very much likes reverse order for memory, for instructions, for arguments. Remember, CDECL arguments were pushed in reverse order onto the stack. Yeah, that occurs a lot. Anyway, it's fascinating. Let's move on. Once we have this result, so at this point in time, EAX holds the value 1400. We loaded a 10 from variable 14, and then we multiplied it with variable 18, which holds 140. So at this point in time, we hold 1400. By the way, in these cases, if you write code and you just multiply stuff and stash it into a certain variable with a certain size, you want to make sure that you don't create an overflow. Like if we were multiplying to very big values that fit into 32-bit variables, but then once they're multiplied, they do not fit into 32-bit variables anymore, we might want to find a bigger spot to store them. That's called an integer overflow. That's a bug. But this is not what's happening here because 1400 isn't too big for 32 bits. We then move that value to EDX and we load another string pointer into RCX. Remember, RCX is the first argument, EDX is the second argument. And then we see the printf being called. By the way, I don't see that very often, but it can happen that the arguments are loaded into registers in a different order. Like it is allowed that we load the string pointer into RCX and then load EAX into EDX, sorry. If these were flipped, it would still be valid code. But for us as analysts, that means we need to be aware that RCX is the first argument and EDX is the second argument. Now with printf, that's kind of clear that the value that we want to fill into the %d is the second argument. But if you look at, again, big binary-based large function, very complicated function calls, it is important to remember the order in which to read the arguments. And then after we called it printf, we have this beautiful print on the screen, the multiplication with the result of 1400. Awesome. Finally, the most important piece of code in here is the multiplication. This tiny bit of code was the main reason why I turned off all and every optimization in this binary, because multiplications can be very tricky. Oh, sorry, divisions. Division. What is happening here? At this point, EAX is loaded with variable 18, which is 140. So EAX holds 140. CDQ is an instruction. I will be very honest with you. I don't exactly remember what CDQ does. It's not something that we see very often, which is why let's do a little Google exercise. What do we do if we don't understand an instruction? What we do is we go to our preferred search engine and type in the instruction. And ideally also the architecture. So if you tell it you're on x64, you get the 64-bit documentation. And then I mentioned it in the very first class. There is this website, it's called felixcloutier.com. I've never actually met the guy, but I'm very grateful because he kind of seems to have digitalized the Intel manual. What you see here is pretty much exactly what the Intel manual says about the instruction. And again, if we don't understand an instruction, we want to read through the documentation to see what exactly is happening. And there it says convert word to double word, convert double word to quad word. CDQ, convert to quad word. Convert double word to quad word. That's what the D stands for. Very interesting. My memory is refreshed. You guys can go ahead and read the text and figure out that the text very often is not extremely helpful because it's in such great detail, the wording in here, and in such particular wording that, like for me personally, this piece of information is enough to understand what the instruction wants to do. If you feel inclined, down here is the exact pseudocode for this one instruction, like how the instruction operates on the values that we handed. That much said, we're short on time. Let's go back to the disassembler. Convert double word to quad word. What does that mean? CDQ converts a 32-bit value and expands it to a 64-bit value. It is interesting that we don't see more of that in here. Is that really what happens? Wait a second. All my stupid talking, it does help if we read the text description. Very sorry. If you read the first sentence in the description, it says doubles the size of the operand in register AX, EAX, or RAX, depending on the operand size, by means of sign extension, and stores the results in registers DX, AX, EDX, RDX, RAX, respectively. Right. So what happens in here is that we take the value that's located in EAX. That's the variable 18 that we loaded in EAX. And we expand it to represent a quad word, hence the D. And then we have a 64-bit value that spans over EDX and EAX. Cool. Once we did this, we start the division. The IDiv instruction has a hard-coded way of going about dividing values. Namely, it doesn't need an operand. It doesn't receive the EAX, like the value itself that we want to divide. IDiv expects the target of the division operation in EAX, or respectively in EAX and EDX. This will be something we can see if we look up the documentation of IDiv as well. So you have seen it too, and I'm not talking my math fuzzy. The question is in the chat, so it doesn't move it to a 64-bit space, but instead makes it take up two 32-bit spaces. That's correct. The instruction was designed to function. So say you're on a 32-bit system, you don't have 64-bit registers, right? If you want to create a bigger value. if you're on a 64-bit system and you need a double quad word, you don't have registers to take up that space, which is why we use those two. It's more like a historical development on Intel. Where was I? Right, the website. We want to see what the IDIF instructions, IDIF instruction is. 60 IDIF instruction x64. We get back to Felix Cloutier. I don't know who the guy is, but I love him. And here we see the signed divide. Something that comes out of the compiler is the compiler knows whether our values that we're operating on are signed or unsigned. And based on whether they're signed or unsigned, the compiler decides which instructions to use on them. And in this case, we see a signed divide. If we look at the description, it says divides the signed value in AX, DXAX, or EDX, EAX, the dividend, by the source operand, the divisor, and stores the result in the AX, AHAL, DX, AX, or EDX, EAX registers. That is my conspiracy theory, but I believe the reason why we use the CDQ instruction to occupy EDX and EAX is because the IDIF instruction expects the values to be located in EDX and EAX to be able to operate the division on them. So our dividend, if you look at this piece of documentation, our dividend must be located in either of these, must be present in either of these forms, in AX or DXAX or EDX EAX. That is all stuff that is hard-coded in instructions. If you look at the operation here is a little bit longer and a little more complicated. Why does an instruction do what it's supposed to do? That is implemented in hardware. Like, if I bring you back to the disassembler, why does the IDIF instruction expect its divisor in a certain way and the dividend in a certain way is predefined by hardware. The reason why our assembly looks the way it does is because the compiler produced it in a way, but the compiler sticks to the rules of the architecture. So if x86, like the x86-64 architecture says that IDIF expects its to operand in this specific manner, then the compiler knows, and the compiler will prepare the disassembly to represent that set of rules. The same goes for other instructions. If we have a quick look again at the multiplication IMUL instruction, IMUL knows to receive two operands. You can't hand IMUL one operand. You can't just IMUL EAX. That will result in an exception. Because IMUL expects these two operands, like at least these two operands, to be present in order to perform its purpose. And IMUL knows that after the multiplication has happened, the result needs to be stored in EAX. This is what happens in this instruction. And part of it is it's intuitive when you read it, but a lot of it is defined by the architecture. It's defined by hardware of like how exactly these instructions operate. So far so good. Then what happens? What's the output of IDIF? So IDIF expects EDX and EAX to contain the dividend, and the divisor is the argument that's handed to the instruction. The result, says the documentation here, and you can't see that because I clicked it away. Here we are again. So dividend is EDX, EAX, divisor is the one value we hand to the IDIF instruction. That's the variable 18 as far as I remember. And after it divides the dividend by the divisor, it stores the result. In our case, that will be EDX and EAX. So far, so good. Back to the assembly. Now that we understand our instruction, what do we see? At this point in time, EDX and EAX hold a value. The value that we load is not actually big enough to fill those registers. I'm so hoping I'm not telling you bullshit right here. We have a 32-bit value. The 32-bit value is really small. Like for the 32-bit space, 140 is not that big. Okay, we load that into EDX. We span it up to two 32-bit registers. We start the division operation. We divide by variable 14. Variable 14 is 10. Effectively, what happens here is that we divide 140 by the value 10. 140 divided by 10. And the result of that ends up in EDX and EAX. You see here in this move instruction loads the value in EAX. That's the result of the division, and loads it into EDX. What happened here is that the compiler recognized that the result that we produced is small enough to fit into our 32-bit register. So this is where we are right now. And EDX has been untouched by this operation. So far, so good. So then, after we executed these instructions, we have a result in EAX. What's the result? The result should be 14. 140 divided by 10 is 14. And this value 14 is then located in the EAX register. Phew, that was exhausting. Finally, we load it into EDX as a second argument to printf, and we load this string as the first argument and then call printf. Awesome. Question in the chat. It needed to be expanded to provide space for the remainder. I think so. Honestly, in binaries, you don't look at this many divisions all of the time. That's why I'm stuttering. But yeah, as you go dividing, there is data that's falling out on the side that needs to be stored somewhere. I'm not actually sure it's the remainder. So like if you divide integers in x86, you have full numbers and there's no floating point involved. So there shouldn't be a remainder that stays. Let me have a quick look at docs again. The docs talk about the remainder. Good. Homework. Read through the documentation of the IDIF instruction and figure out why exactly we need EDX in this operation. That might be a good exercise. Because you can see if you look at the assembly, you don't really need EDX. And the compiler has recognized that as well. But the instruction still expects us to provide EDX as part of the dividend. I wasn't actually aware this was going to happen. That's very interesting. But yeah, look through the docs here and try to figure out what exactly happens with the EDX register throughout this operation. That might be a nice exercise. For us, we have succeeded and analyzed this function, because now all that happens after the printf is we free space on the stack, like with this add RSP 38. We reset RSP to the value it had at the beginning of the function, and then we return. There was a question. Can you explain how the stack was managed during the entire process? Sure. Wait, no, actually, the entire picture is a bit difficult because we have call instructions in here. the stack for us, a first word about the stack. Again, it's not actually that important for us how exactly the stack looks like at each step. It is important to analyze in certain for certain objectives. Like if you find a Stack Overflow bug and you want to write an exploit for it, you will be very interested about how exactly the stack looks like at a given point in time, if you know what I mean. If you go reverse engineering a large binary, you do not want to know how the stack looks like in every given point in time, because that's a lot of information that doesn't get you very far. For us here, what happened to the stack? There wasn't much happening to the stack at all. In this function, we reserved space in the stack. We freed space in the stack. Whoops. We freed space in the stacks. And in between, we used variables that are located on the stack. So we wrote data to the stack, and we loaded data from the stack right here. Okay. We didn't push anything. We didn't pop anything from the stack in this function. What did happen, though, is we called printf 3 times. Printf in our case here sticks to the same calling convention. So printf expects its arguments. Printf will go ahead and reserve space on the stack. Like we see here, printf will do the same thing. And printf will have its own use for the stack. So like, if we just read this function, we don't know exactly what's going to happen to the stack inside of these called functions. They have their own kind of life going on. But what we do now is after we return from that function, like after we hit the instruction, whoops, the instruction that comes after we hit right here, the stack pointer will have the same state as it had before. So whatever RSP's value was here, it will have the same value right after. Otherwise, the holy balance of the stack pointer will be disturbed. And that is not good for function execution. Same thing though happens, like if we have a quick look at the return instruction down here, if we return from our function here, we return back to main. At this point in time, the stack pointer needs to be reset, like the stack pointer needs to be healthy in order for the other functions that will execute after to execute properly. And this is pretty much all that's important about the stack in here. And we will look at more functions and more stack pointers, and it will all make more sense as we go along. Okay. Now that we analyze this function, we can give it a proper name. And if you follow me and click at the function name, like the sub underscore in the beginning, and click N, you get this little pop-up that says rename address. And we'll call it arithmetic, because we only did math in here. Very boring. Good. So far so good. Now we click escape and get back to the main function where we came from. And you can start to see a pattern there. Like we look at the function, we see calls and jumps to different addresses. We follow those calls and the jumps. We go there. We analyze what's there. We have analyzed that. We come back. We rename and document our learnings in the code. You can imagine it's not always that simple, because there can be a function call that calls a function, that calls another function, that calls another function, that calls another function, and then you can spend a lot of time walking down that rabbit hole of the different functions. And in reality, what's important in there is just to figure out what's important for you. Like if you go reverse engineering, you don't usually do what we just did and read every instruction and analyze it in detail, but you go trying to figure out the important parts. The important parts might be, you look at a piece of ransomware and you want to figure out where the file encryption is happening, like what kind of crypto algorithm did the crooks implement. Or you look at a bug, you look at the potential buffer overflow, and you want to analyze in the binary of like, if I craft my input that wants to trigger that bug, like how does the stack look like exactly in that space, and how do I need to tweak the input in order to reach the bug but not corrupt the stack and not corrupt anything else that's important either. And for that purpose, you need to go reverse engineering around that area where the bug is located. And yeah, again, depending on the exact objective you have, and like what exactly you want to do, you might have different goals inside of a binary. And almost none of these goals involves reading each and every instruction from top to bottom. This is just something we do here for exercise. Good. Next function. That's the string operation, and those are the functions. You know what? Let's start at this one down here. So these two functions, the sub 14,000, 1180 and the sub 14,000, 1000, they don't do anything specifically important. They are just there for us to look at function calls, I think. Yeah. All right. So let's start off with this first function here, the sub 14,000, 1180. Yes, we skipped one in the middle, but we'll get back there at the end of the class. So this function here, you'll see immediately that it receives two arguments, argument 5 and argument f. Argument f can also be displayed as argument 15. Again, you can right-click any number, and in the disassembly, you get a little pop-up that shows you different representations. I could also represent it as octal, which is not very helpful, but the same number means 17 in octal. Let's go back to decimal. Decimal is not nice. Decimal is 15. So the first argument to this function is 5, and the second argument to this function is 15. Then let's see what's going on inside the function. Something that you'll notice quickly is that, yes, IDPro recognized we have arguments going on in here, argument 0 and argument 8, based on the offset from the stack pointer, plus. But what IDA didn't do, and what IDA shouldn't do, like what your disassembler shouldn't do, is tell you the values that were handed over. You jump into a function, you start analyzing, you recognize there's arguments that are being used in the disassembly. Those arguments have been handed over. Let me just quickly jump back. Those arguments have been handed over. So you have the 5 and the 15. That's our arguments. Something that I see, some trap that I see students jump into is we look at a very simple binary where this function is called once. Where it would be alluring to just go and rename these arguments with 5 and 15 because that's naturally the value that they will be having. But what happens if you're in a big binary? I'm back here in main again, sorry for the jumping back and forth. What happens in a bigger binary is usually a function is called multiple times. This is why we have functions, right? So you write a function in your code, and then whenever you need that function, you call it. And every time you call it, you might or might not hand it different arguments. So the second time we call that function, that might be a 6, and this might be a 27, or whichever values the developer picked. So for us, it's important to notice, you go into that function, you go analyzing that code that you see in there. You do not rely on the values that you saw as arguments. We see two dwords being handed over. This is about as much information that we can derive from the values that are handed to the function. Good, so far so good. This is something that usually needs to sink in a lot, that functions can have different arguments every time they are called. Anyhow, for us important is that we had two, and it was two dwords, like two numbers actually. And then we will also have a local variable. That is very useless in this case. Never mind. First move instruction stores our argument in EDX to the designated space on the stack. This is the funny thing I talked about before in 64-bit, where Arguments that are handed over in registers, they are handed over in registers to save time because every push to the stack takes a lot more time than move to register or whatever, maybe, possibly. And the stack frame that we're looking at still holds space for these arguments. So even though they're handed over in registers, if you turn off optimization, which is what I did here, is they still land on their designated spot on the stack. And they will always have the spot in the stack, like the space will always be reserved, I think. You guys might know better than me because you read the blog post, right? I did too, a long time ago. Anyhow, the next important thing that we're looking at here is the sub instruction, sub RSP 38. Again, we need space for our local variables, but we also make space for the incredibly big 64-bit stack frame. Interesting here is that we do this after we stored our arguments to the stack, which is why RSP here is not moved anywhere. So RSP is still at the base of the function stack frame. And then we just add the location of the stack locations. Like we just add the offset of the stack location, sorry, where we want to store our arguments to. You see here for the arguments, the offsets are positive. So they are located below the current stack pointer. You remember in a blog post they talked about home spaces? So like when you enter a function, your stack pointer points to the base of the local frame, of the local function frame, and at that point in time, potential arguments that were handed over through the stack are already on the stack. They're below. And then if you add a value to RSP, you get to those values that are below the current stack pointer. And the same thing happens with that home space of arguments that is somehow also located below the stack pointer. And by adding values to the stack pointer, we walk down to get to those spaces. Whew, that's exciting. But yeah, then we see the sub RSP and at the end of the function, the add RSP. So we again make a lot of space on the local stack frame. Then after we did that, you see that everything that's referenced from RSP, like here the RSP plus 38, is again modified by those 38 bytes to get back to the base, and from there actually access the argument that before we could access without the plus 38. Go. Which reminds me, as soon as I start mumbling, I have to have a sip of coffee. Oh, much better. Good. This much about all the stacks. Now, what is actually happening in here? It's going to be interesting. So let's go instruction by instruction again. The most peculiar thing that we want to get at is this call instruction down here. Generally, what you see, instruction by instruction is the boring part. There is a reverse engineering trick that I like very much. That sounds like a super dirty trick, but it saves you so much time. If you go about reverse engineering a function, I usually start in the middle. I don't know if other reverse engineers did it too. It seems logical to me, but I'm not sure I'm supposed to teach you that. But if you look at this block, like here's all the stack interactions in the beginning, and variables are pushed and moved and modified, and then in the end you see the return and like all the cleanup, and these two instructions essentially just load a value into EAX to return it. Which leaves us with what's going on in the middle, which is this part here. I can see the middle very quickly, but like literally in most functions, you take the graph and you zoom into the middle, and like this is usually where the interesting part is happening. I'm not kidding. With a little bit of experience, you will be able to filter out all the smafu that's like not actually that interesting, like this part and this part, and you will be able to just like magically spot where the interesting stuff is going on, which for us would be that call. Dirty tricks. Anyhow, we want to do this properly, and for you guys, it's important still to actually be able to filter out the stuff that's not all that interesting, like all the stack operations. So let's jump in here at this move instruction. Remember, we just allocated ourselves space on the stack, which we might or might not actually use. And in this move, the first thing that we see is that argument 0 is loaded into EAX. Now you could remember that argument 0, I think that was the 5 or the 15, one of those. Doesn't really make much difference. Then we add a value to argument 0, which is 14 in hex, which is 20 in decimal. So we have a numeric value in EAX and we add the 20. We store that back into argument 0. Argument 0 is not really the argument that we get, but it's a spot on the stack. Remember, it's just like a little slot that we reserved in the stack. Okay, so now argument 0 holds arg0 plus 20. And then what happens is we start a function call. Again, sometimes you need to read disassembly from the bottom up, and you see that call here, and then you see ECX being initialized with arg8, you see EDX being initialized with arg0, and you see R8D, like the D word portion of R8, the lower 32-bit, being initialized with 6E. 6E is 110 in decimal. What happened? We loaded whatever was in argument 0, we added 20 to it. We use this as the second argument to the next function. Okay, so remember at this point in time, we can actually add a comment for that to have practiced that as well. If you type in the double dots, I think that's called semicolon in English, then you get a little box that says please enter text. There you can enter a comment. And in there, we will comment that argument 0 at that point in time. I will be adding my comment right here where the EDX will hold the value that we just calculated. EDX at this point is arg0 plus 20. Click OK. Then we have this nice commentary here. You can imagine if you analyze a binary with millions of instructions, you are not going to put comments next to every instruction. You will only want to do that if you figured out something very important that you might forget over time, then you put a comment in there and move along with your life. Okay, so EDX here holds the value 20. By the way, the highlighting also works in the comments, which is very neat. ECX will hold argument 8. So the other number that we handed to the function, I believe that was 15, lands in ECX. And the third argument is 110. So then, oh good God, I said multiply, not addition, what the hell? Plus, important. Addition is something very different from multiplication. Good. So at this point in time, we have 3 numbers in these arguments, and then we go on to call the next function. This means that by the time we call that function, the stack pointer has a certain value. So the stack pointer points to the top of the stack. RSP at this point in time points to the top of wherever these 38 hexadecimal bytes end up. So they land our stack pointer somewhere on top of the function frame. And this is where RSP is pointing at when we call this function here. Let's jump right in. function is very simple again. Thank God. And in there, we see the nice commentary of Ida, which tells us that there is 3 arguments that have been handed over. Remember, we had 3 numeric arguments. These came as registers. The first thing we do is we stash the arguments in the registers to their designated spot on the stack. Again, this is something, if we were using optimization, this is something that would not happen. Actually, that's something that you can try as homework as well. That might be very interesting. You take the C file that I've located on the GitHub, like the virtualbh.c, and you load it into a compiler. Preferably, like I like to use Visual Studio 2012 for compiling exercises, because Visual Studio 2012 is still like nice and tame and produces pretty binaries. But technically, you can use any other as well. Like you can use GCC, like load it on Linux and compile it with GCC first without optimizations, and then gradually start to add in optimization steps. And if you then continuously load the binary into either Pro, you will see that the assembly changes. And you will get to a point where the assembly makes absolutely no sense to you whatsoever. And yeah, I think that's a nice exercise to do and to look at. More so because if you do that with different optimization settings, you get, I don't know, like 3 different or 10 different binaries if you want to try. And you can go reverse engineering the same code again and again, and you will always learn something new. And that actually sounds exciting. Yeah, let's do that. Your homework for today, and we still have 20 minutes to go. Your homework for today will be to take the virtualbh.c file and compile it with your compiler of choice a couple times with and without optimization, and do the same thing we did in class today, like walk through this function and walk through all the functions and see what the compiler did to your binary. I do not expect you to understand it all. Like, don't worry. You don't have to come out of it and say like, oh my God, I'm a master reverse engineer now. I have analyzed and optimized binary. That's not what's going to happen. It'll be slightly confusing, but if you stare at stuff for a long time, actually, reverse engineering involves a lot of staring and thinking. So if you have to stare a lot while you look at those exercise binaries, don't worry. That's usually the nature of the cause. And yeah, as you go staring, you will figure out one or another thing. You will see how the stack interaction changed. You will see how there's a lot less instructions in front of you. A lot of those will be optimized away. And as you do so, you will see patterns that you have seen before. A lot of learning reverse engineering is recognizing patterns. So like, if you look at, let me take a quick step here. If you look at a call, you see a call instruction. Your brain goes, oh, there's a call. I know there might be arguments. You start scanning the instructions on top of the call instruction to see whether there is argument operations going on, like whether arguments are being prepared. If you see that, you know that these instructions and the call instruction belong together. You just spotted a pattern. And in reality, like binaries or assembly code is full of patterns. You see the pattern of preparing the stack in the beginning. You see the pattern of modifying, a value like a move and an add, like these two go together. And if you look at the bigger function, that can be very, very helpful in order to know how to go about reading the binary in front of you. But you will only be able to, let me go back into the function, to see the patterns in front of you if you've seen enough of those patterns. And the trick about learning that is exercises. Practice, practice, practice. I can keep talking all day and keep talking my mouth fuzzy about patterns and calls and instructions and all that. Me talking about it will not teach you reverse engineering. What will teach you reverse engineering is to go ahead and do it. So yes, that was a very long introduction to your homework. Goeth forth and compileth and have fun. Good, but before you do that, we still have 20 minutes to go. That's good. Here we are in the second function. So quick recap, the first function we looked at We saw it calls another function. We still don't know what that one is doing, but we know that it receives 3 arguments, and those 3 arguments are numbers. And we go in there and figure out what the function does with these 3 numeric values. It will turn out not very much. First thing that happens is the arguments are put back onto the stack. We don't have local variables in here, and we don't have any proper stack usage at all, so the compiler decided that we don't need to reserve space on the stack. You don't see the sub instruction, and you don't see anything subtracted from RSP and RSP being pushed up and down and around. To be very honest with you, I do not understand the intricacies of why compilers make decisions about where the stack pointer needs to be while a function is being executed. It's all explainable, it's all understandable. I just never actually took the time to deep dive into this because mostly it's not a requirement. Again, you don't sit there with the graphic of the stack next to you and like start painting diagrams as you go reverse engineering. Not usually. Like in most cases, that's not what happens. Anyhow, so in this case, the compiler decided we don't need to reserve space on the stack for executing this function. Good. After we stored our arguments to the stack, now we have arg0, arg8, and arg10 actually holding values. We load arg8 into EAX, we load arg0 into ECX, and we add them. Store the result into ECX, and then we move the result from ECX to EAX. At this point in time, EAX holds the sum of the first 2 arguments that were handed over to the function. Awesome. Then we move on. This move instruction here loads the 3rd argument, arg_10. All these numbers can be super confusing. It's the 3rd argument, but it's called argument 10. And the 10 only tells us what's the offset from the stack pointer in this case. So yeah, brace yourself. And by the way, the discrepancy here, we have argument 0, but it's at offset 8 from the stack pointer. So stack pointer plus 8 brings us to argument 0. There is an extra value in between the stack pointer and the local argument in order to, for the stack pointer, once we're in the function, to get back to the home space that's underneath, we need to jump over the return pointer. I think that's what it is. So like there is an 8-byte value that's already on the stack, and we need to jump over that value to get to the arguments that are underneath, like the argument space that's underneath. That's some intricacy. I'm not sure we have talked about that in detail yet. I might have mentioned it every now and then, but it's something that's very, very important. The call instruction implicitly pushes a return value on the stack. That's how the call instruction is implemented in hardware. So the call instruction always pushes a return value in the stack. The return value is the address of the instruction that follows the call. So if you look at the function and you see a call instruction, the instruction that comes after has an address, and that address is a return address that the call instruction pushes on the stack. So then if you think of your stack layout, there is a space that's reserved for that return address. And important for us here is we have this return instruction down here. And the return instruction is hard-coded to fetch the last value on the stack and push it into the instruction pointer. So return technically pops a value from the stack and puts it into RIP. This is how the instruction is implemented. That mechanism has caused a lot of joy and headache in the security community, but I won't be deep diving into that now. But you see that it is very important that the stack frame, like that the balance on the stack remains intact. Like if we push more stuff on the stack than we pop off the stack before we hit the return, then the return instruction would fetch the wrong return address from the stack, and our execution would go to Nirvana. That usually causes a crash. And compilers are very good at making sure that doesn't happen. And that is a good thing for us. Cryptors sometimes do different, but that's a different topic as well. Good. This much about the return address. Where were we? We added these two values and we moved the result of the addition into EAX. Then we load the third argument, which is called arg10, right? That's where we were. We load arg10 into ECX and subtract the result of the first operation from ECX. So what we do is we add argument 1 and 2, and then we subtract that value from argument 3. Very exciting. And that result is stored into EAX. EAX is stored into argument 10. So the variable, if you want to imagine this as C code, the third argument, or you have, let's say it's variable C. So variable C equals A plus B. No, variable C equals C minus A plus B in brackets. That's the operation we're looking at here. All right, but since our return value based on our calling convention needs to be located in EAX or REX in this case, we then go and load the value back into REX and then return. You see, this is very useless. Like this here is really, really extremely useless. If we were using optimization, this would be gone, and we would, like the compiler would have recognized that at this point in time, EAX already holds the return value. We'll just skip these two instructions and would have returned from there. Which now, if you read the assembly, it makes a lot more sense. But imagine the compiler just goes, takes the source code, interprets the different tokens that are in there, and like slices them into pieces. And from there creates a syntax tree. And from the syntax tree, without, like, if we wouldn't use a modern day compiler with all the optimization is in there, you would just go take the syntax tree and translate each token that you see in there into assembly. This is pretty much what happened with this binary. Like, the syntax tree saw that there is variable C equals a value, and saw that there's other operations happening in that value, like you have C minus A plus B. Okay, the compiler goes and splits up A plus B is one operation, C minus the result of A plus B is one operation, and C equals the result of that second operation. So it's 3 steps that are being taken, and these 3 steps, one after another, are being translated into assembly. This is what you see right here. This is why you have these instructions dealing with the additions, then these instructions dealing with the subtraction, and then these instructions with dealing with stashing the result in our third argument. So the compiler really just goes about translating bit by bit. And if we would add optimization after this bit by bit translation, like before and in the middle and in between and at all steps, the optimizer would go and take out all the things that are unnecessary. Like it would analyze and see like these instructions are useless and these instructions are useless. And then we end up with properly optimized x86 code, which can be very, very confusing. Good, so far so good. We're almost up on time. Let's recap. This is the second function. It equals C minus A plus B. What do we call that? Not arithmetic. I'll be lazy. I'll just call it more math. More math. Good. In here, what we do is, again, we add A and like argument 1 and 2 and subtract this from argument 3. And this is the result that we hand back in REX. If we take a step back with escape, now we know what's happening in this function. We can put it in the bigger picture and see what it does in the context with this function. That means for this particular call at this particular spot, we know exactly which values are handed over. That was, let me just quickly have a look to be sure, 15 and 5. Okay, so in our function here, argument 0 was 5 and argument 8 was 15. If we want to figure out what exactly happens here, is we could calculate 5 plus 20. So EDX would be 25, ECX would be 15, and R8 would be 110. So then what this function would be doing is 110 minus 25 plus 15 in brackets. So 25 plus 15 gives us 40, right? Yeah, 40. And then we subtract 40 from 110, which is 70. So at this point in time, with this one specific call of these functions, remember again, if this function is called elsewhere with different arguments, then the result is different. But in this specific case, EAX holds the value 70 once we return from the more math function. Oof, that's a lot of mathematics. Huh. And yeah, all that we do with it is we stash it in a variable, load that variable into EAX, because that's our return register, and then we return. And then we go and name this function math. Due to lack of better naming, lack of better naming. I'll be honest with you, I suck at naming functions, which is why they usually have like very, very useless names when I work on them. And my IDAPRO databases look hilarious based on that function naming problem. So far, so good. We analyzed 2 functions, which isn't nearly enough, but it's a start. Right. Should we do a quick round of questioning before we start into... We have 2 more exercises, actually. Anyway, we can do that next time, but is there any questions before we start into the next exercises? Any questions that need me? Because I think the moderators actually... You guys are winging this. It's awesome. Any questions left for me? Now's your chance. Silence. Oh. What are the next steps from learning RE and moving into a career? That's a big one. Interesting spot in time to ask that too. So, reverse engineering is not a job. It's a common misperception. Reverse engineering is a skill. The skill is needed in many different jobs, but reverse engineering alone is barely ever the only thing you will be doing in a job. It is a very valuable skill. It is a very, very well-paid skill that's be said too. And learning it can help you enter in malware analysis. It can help you enter in DFIR and forensics. It can help you in offensive security and exploitation. It is very helpful in hardware security research. That's where I'm at right now. It sometimes, actually what I notice, it sometimes gives you this edge. If a company is looking for, or say you're experienced in software development and you also have experience in reverse engineering, that can give you this little edge over other candidates, and scoring a rather complex position. Like knowing how to read assembly helps you, for example, in software debugging. You can load stuff into GDB and analyze a bug on the assembly level. What's a very nice role to jump into when you just start your career is actually malware analysis. Malware analysis is where I got started, and turns out that big security companies, like for example, big antivirus companies or uh, companies that focus on incident response and threat detection, or threat intelligence companies and stuff like that, they're usually more willing to hire junior engineers that have more motivation than experience, that come in with one or another curious skill, and hire them into junior positions where they can develop their own skill portfolio from inside of a company. That's essentially what happened to me. I started out with zero experience at an enterprise company as an analyst, and I learned a lot working there. I loved my job, that to say too. And Yeah, they were happy to hire me straight out of university. They gave me the simple tasks first, and then over time, more complex tasks, and eventually I was reverse engineering malware, and that was super cool. That is a rather long conversation now, and I see we're running out of time. Yeah, if you have questions about that, or anytime if you have questions, actually, feel free to send me a DM on Twitter, and I'm happy to have a long conversation about that. Good. No other questions. Cool. For the last few minutes, let's look at another exercise. There was a thing that I still wanted to show you. So we'll leave this one for the next class. And let's just have a quick look at this one sub down here. This one exercise, remember, what I wanted to show you is a large function call. Like what happens if we have more than 4 arguments. If you follow me down to the call to sub 14,000, 1,000, what you want to do first is look up in the instruction stash and see all these move instructions. So all of these are dealing with our function arguments. I was nice and I numbered them. So it's like little integers that have the values 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. This displays beautifully the reverse order in which assembly handles arguments. So these can be mixed up, especially since we're looking at registers. We could initialize ECX up here and EDX down here, and it would still be valid. But usually, what the compiler does is, in most cases, you see them put in order, and that order is reverse. So if you think about a function call, if you think about this call, which like opens the brackets, and then first argument is 1, -2, -3, 4, 5, and 6. You see this in front of you as a C code. You close the bracket and the dash dot. And what the compiler does with that is like it puts it upside down, it like pushes them onto the stack or moves them into registers like in the reverse order. Then for us, what's interesting is like the first 4 land in registers. If you remember the calling convention, we start with ECX, then EDX, then R8D and R9, or R8 and R9. The D just tells us it's a D word, like it's a 32-bit argument. To be honest, you don't even need 32 bits to represent a 3. You just need 3 bits. Anyhow. And after we loaded these 4 registers with the first 4 arguments, we still have 2 left, and those go into the stack. Remember the calling conventions. Remember the calling conventions. Only 4 arguments are loaded in registers, and the rest goes to stack. So if we would have 16 arguments, then 12 of those would go to the stack, and we would have a very long list here. And yeah, that's beautiful to look at. And then now we know we have 6 arguments that are handed over to this function. If we jump in there, we see this beautiful, very simple function in front of us. We're technically out of time. Let's do some speed reverse engineering. So like at the beginning, you see the stash where the arguments are being stored and stuck into their designated stack slots, which isn't interesting to us at all. Then the sub instruction, which reserves space on the stack, which isn't interesting to us at all either. Then we get to the interesting part where the arguments, you see this long list of arguments. These are the 6 arguments that we handed over to the function. They are stored to registers, and those registers are stored to local variables, at least 3 of them. So arg28, which is number 6, argument number 6 goes into variable 18. Argument number 5, which is arg20 here, goes into variable 20. And argument number 4 goes into variable 28. Then these variables are actually slots on the stack. So these are like local variables, but they can also be used as arguments for the next function that we want to call. That will make more sense if you follow me down to the call instruction. Here's the call to printf, and printf receives the format string. You see here it's prenamed format Again, this is just an address like in the binary, and IDA came up with this beautiful name for it. We load that into the first argument. So we're on the next function call down here. The first argument to that function call is loaded into RCX. RCX is the first. Then RDX, or in this case EDX, would be the second, R8 the third, and R9 the fourth. See again, these four here, these four registers, make up our first four arguments for printf. And if you look at that format string, you will have an idea of what's going to happen. So printf receives this format string as the first argument, and then number 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 will be the numeric values that we handed over to the function. So these %d here, all these %ds, those are placeholders if we want to print all of these numbers that we just handed over to the function. That happens, again, the first 3 of those will be stashed in registers, and the last 3 will be stashed on the stack, which is what's happening here. So they're called variables, but they're not really variables, they're actually arguments. Again, naming is hard because they're just depicting, or they're just like identifying a given slot on the stack. By the time we reach that call down here, these 3 values that we store on the stack here will be nicely lined up for the next function call. And this function call down here actually accepts 7 arguments: the format string and the 6 numeric values that we handed to our function here. So you see, with large functions or like large stack frames can become a little more confusing. And I totally understand if this was out too quick and you need to go back to have a closer look at it. But don't forget, staring is all it takes. Like, you need to stare at it for a long time. If you see an instruction that doesn't make sense to you, look up the documentation and remember all the things that we did in the classes before. I know it gets very overwhelming as we go through the chapter. Like, you need to remember the individual jobs of registers. You need to remember how the stack looks like. You need to remember that dereferencing some value takes you to the content of that address. Like, you dereference an address and it takes you to what's stored at this address, as opposed to just like regular numerical arithmetics. And then, yes, you're reading instruction by instruction, and at the end of the day, you understand what the code in front of you does. That's what a reverse engineer is there for, right? Good. We got through this exercise okay, I would say, and time is up. Now, is there any burning questions that we still need to deal with today? I generally don't mind reading technical books on a tablet, electronic copies. Oh, yeah, just a quick note on books. There is this text file that's located in the GitHub repo, and in there are some links, but also 2 books that I listed that I can totally recommend reading. My favorite one is called Secrets of Reverse Engineering. It's old and it's exclusively focused on 32-bit, but it's just a really good introduction to all the topics that you need to know before you can reverse engineer. Like, what are the tools? What's the file format? How do we read the code? What's the stack for, and all that stuff. That's really helpful. From my understanding, copy or move from memory to memory is not possible. We have to use a register. Not entirely. You can move to a dereferenced pointer, like to a memory address. I think the add instruction requires registers. I would recommend open up the Intel manual and look at exactly what they expect. The question is actually an interesting one, though. Since you asked, let's have a quick look again at Chrome, and there you see at the top of the page is this table. It looks rather cryptic, but it's actually very helpful. In there you see, for example, IDIF, R, M8, R, M16, R, M32, and R, M64. R stands for register and M stands for memory, and the number stands for the width. So IDIF can accept a register or a memory constant in 8, 16, 32, or 64 bits width. And for every instruction that you look up in the manual, you will get this table and you will see which operands can the instruction consume. And if we do this, we're out of time, we can do this right now. But if you look up move, you will see exactly what the move instruction can consume in operands. Further reading. Thanks for the recommendation. You're welcome. I love to give people pointers. If I give people pointers and people go ahead and read books and do exercises by themselves, then I'm technically out of a job. Like I don't have to teach anymore. Right? That'd be awesome. All right, we're hilariously out of time for today. I'll cut it here, and I'll see you guys back on Thursday. If there was anything unclear in the class, you're welcome to watch the stream again and again and again. And if you have any questions, please, please, please reach out to me on Twitter. My DMs are open, and I'd be happy to answer questions. All that said, I'll now get back to my day job, and you guys all have a good day or afternoon or evening or good night.